On the night of April 27, 1938, more than 1,000 people crowded into the town hall in Enfield, Massachusetts for a dance. They called it the Farewell Ball. Another 2,000 people stood outside in the dark, unable to get tickets, listening to the music through the walls. When the orchestra stopped at midnight, the room went quiet. Someone cried out. Then the band played Auld Lang Syne. A reporter from the Springfield Union was in the room. He wrote, "Hardened men were not ashamed to take out their handkerchiefs. Children who had come with their parents began to sob. At midnight the dancing stopped. At midnight the town of Enfield legally ceased to exist. So did the towns of Dana, Greenwich, and Prescott. 4 Massachusetts towns, home to 2,500 people, 6 churches, 13 schools, centuries of accumulated American life were erased from the map by an act of the state legislature so that Boston could have a reservoir. Over the next 7 years, the valley was cleared, the buildings burned, the roads dismantled, the bodies exhumed. In 1946, the water reached full level. The people who danced at that last ball, who watched their churches burn, who watched the water rise, most of them are gone. The ones who are still alive are very old. Their stories are almost gone with them. The Swift River Valley of central Massachusetts had been inhabited for almost as long as European settlement existed in America. The Nipmuc people had lived there for centuries before the colonists arrived, calling the area Quabbin, the meeting of many waters. European settlers found exactly what they were looking for: rich farmland, 3 branches of the Swift River, forests full of timber. By the mid-19th century, 4 distinct towns had grown up in the valley. Enfield was the largest and most prosperous, home to textile mills and a thriving commercial main street. Greenwich was a quieter farming town, its hills covered with orchards. Dana had a soapstone quarry and a hat factory and a common that its residents had tended for 150 years. Prescott, the smallest and most remote, had a population that peaked at over 750 people in 1830 and dwindled to a few dozen by 1938, old farming families who had decided, generation after generation, to stay. These were not dying towns. The Boston Globe, reporting on the forced evacuation, described the valley as containing at least 6 churches, 13 schools, and 60 summer camps. The valley was referred to in contemporary accounts as the most beautiful area in the state. The farms were working farms, the churches were active churches, the town halls still held meetings, the general stores still operated, the graveyards held the graves of the people who had built the valley, their stones going back 200 years. And the people who lived there in 1938 were in many cases the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those people. They were not strangers to this land, they were the land. The roots went back before the Revolution. Some of the farms in Dana and Greenwich had been worked by the same families since the 1730s. The graveyard in Enfield had stones going back to the 1730s as well. When the government came to take the valley, it was not taking land that had been recently settled. It was taking the accumulated investment of 7 generations, and it paid $108 per acre. The decision to sacrifice the Swift River Valley for a reservoir did not arrive suddenly. It arrived slowly, over decades, which in some ways made it worse. Boston's water problem had been building since the 1880s. The city's population was growing rapidly, and its existing water sources, a series of smaller reservoirs built further and further west as each one proved inadequate, could not keep up with demand. By 1895, the Massachusetts Board of Health had already identified the Swift River Valley as a potential reservoir site. The people in the valley read the report. They thought they were safe. The scope of what would be required, displacing 2,500 people, demolishing hundreds of buildings, moving thousands of graves, would surely cause the government to look elsewhere. They were wrong. In 1927, the state legislature passed the Swift River Act. The valley was condemned. The residents would have until April 28, 1938, 11 years to leave. 11 years sounds like a long time. In practice, it was 11 years of watching your town die in slow motion. From the moment the act passed, the valley's future was fixed. No business would invest in a town that was going to be underwater in a decade. No family would move to a condemned community. Property values fell. Young people left. The population of the 4 towns declined steadily through the 1930s, not because people wanted to go, but because staying became economically irrational. The government's approach to the displacements was businesslike in the most chilling sense. Surveyors arrived to assess property values. Offers were made. The offers were rarely generous. The $108 per acre average was a Depression-era price for land whose value to the families who had farmed it for generations was incalculable. Residents who refused to sell eventually had their land taken by eminent domain. There was no appeal. What the government could not take by eminent domain was the knowledge the valley's residents carried with them. They knew which fields flooded in wet years and which stayed dry. They knew where the springs were that ran cold in August. They knew the family histories that were buried in the graveyards, not just names and dates but stories, feuds, alliances, the whole living texture of a place accumulated over 2 centuries. They knew the old paths through the woods, the swimming holes, the spots where the trout ran in May. When they left, they took it with them. When they died, it was gone. Beginning in 1930, the physical destruction of the valley began. The first work was the construction of the 2 dams, the Windsor Dam and the Goodenough Dike that would hold the water. Then came the clearing. Thousands of workers, many of them from the Civilian Conservation Corps, began the systematic removal of everything in the valley. The trees were cut and the stumps pulled, the buildings were stripped of anything salvageable and then burned. The valley was on fire, neighbors later said, for months. Every structure had to be documented, assessed, and removed or burned. The 14 mills that had operated in the valley were razed, 31.5 miles of railroad track were pulled up, 242 miles of roads were abandoned, 60 summer camps were dismantled. And then there were the graves. More than 30 cemeteries existed in the 4 towns. They held over 1,760 burials, 2 centuries of the valley's dead. Every body had to be exhumed, identified where possible, and reinterred elsewhere. Workers moved through the old graveyards with shovels and records, digging up graves that in some cases had not been touched since the 1700s. The remains were carefully transported to the new Quabbin Park Cemetery, built outside the flood zone. One woman, whose family had farmed in Greenwich since the 1780s, was there when her grandmother's grave was exhumed. She described watching the last connection between her family and the land they had worked for 6 generations lifted out of the ground and placed in a box for transport somewhere else. Some residents found ways to resist in small measures. A woman in Enfield refused to sell her Victorian house through normal channels. Instead, she had the floors pulled up, the hardware removed, the trim stripped, and the grand staircase disassembled and transported to a new house she built in the neighboring town. The house the government burned was a shell. What had been her home was already somewhere else. The Congregational Church of Prescott was saved by being disassembled piece by piece and moved to South Hadley, Massachusetts, where it still stands today as a museum. Most buildings were simply burned. By March 28, the Metropolitan District Water Supply Commission had taken formal possession of all land by eminent domain. The last residents went in late April. On April 27, they held the ball. The flooding began August 14, 1939. The valley filled over 7 years. The water reached full level in June 1946. Across the United States, between roughly 1900 and 1970, the government deliberately flooded hundreds of communities to create reservoirs for water supplies, hydroelectric power, and flood control. Almost all followed the same pattern. An agency identified the land, legislation was passed, compensation was offered at a fraction of real value, and the communities were erased. In Tennessee, the Tennessee Valley Authority, created by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, flooded dozens of communities as it built its dams. Lewiston, Tennessee, a small trading town on the Clinch River, was submerged by Norris Lake in 1936. The TVA conducted sociological surveys and brought the photographer Lewis Hine to document the town before flooding. Most residents relocated to the surrounding hills and formed a community called New Lewiston, but the graves of their ancestors were underwater. The land they had farmed for 100 years was underwater. The place was gone. Butler, Tennessee, the largest incorporated town ever deliberately flooded by the TVA, held out until 1948. The town organized itself, purchasing 200 acres on higher ground and physically relocating 125 homes and 50 other structures. Families slept in their houses in Old Butler on Monday and woke in New Butler on Tuesday. The 1954 drought lowered Watauga Lake enough to expose the old streets and foundations, and former residents gathered to walk through what remained of the drowned town. Many wept. In Appalachia, the construction of Fontana Dam displaced over 1,300 families from mountain communities including Proctor, Judson, and Bushnell in North Carolina. Some residents were paid less than 50 cents per acre. The cemeteries of these communities can only be reached by ferry, inaccessible to the grandchildren of the people buried there except by crossing the lake that covers the land. The Cherokee town of Tennessee, the town from which the state of Tennessee takes its name, was flooded by the TVA's Tellico Reservoir in 1979. The name Tennessee comes from a place that is now underwater. In all these cases, the pattern is the same. The government decided the land was more valuable as a reservoir than as a home. The people carried their knowledge of place with them. They carried it until they died. Today, the Quabbin Reservoir supplies drinking water to 3 million people in Greater Boston. It is 39 square miles of clear, cold water surrounded by forests that grew up after the clearing. It is beautiful. People hike around it in autumn. It has won awards for water quality. At the bottom of the reservoir, under 130 feet of water in some places, are the roads of Enfield and Dana and Greenwich and Prescott, the stone walls that the farmers built to clear their fields, the foundations of the houses, the old paths through the woods, the depressions in the earth where the graveyards were before the graves were moved. In drought years, when the water level drops, some of these things become visible. Hikers find old road surfaces emerging from the water's edge, the pavement intact under the reservoir for 80 years. The stone walls appear, the cellar holes of old houses, the Dana Town Common, the green at the center of the town that residents tended for 150 years, remains above water level. You can walk to it on a trail from Route 32A. There is nothing on it. The buildings that once surrounded it are gone. The people who once gathered on it are almost entirely gone. It is just a level clearing in the forest, with cellar holes in the trees around it and the sound of birds. The last person alive who danced at the farewell ball of April 27, 1938, is very old now, or gone. The last person who remembered Enfield as a living town, who shopped at its stores and worshipped in its churches and knew its neighbors by name, is nearly gone. No one wrote it down.